I'm Brian Clem, and I have the great honor to welcome you to the celebration of a life well lived. You know, it's about cocktail hour, so I suspect that George is going to swing by, have a drink, offer a few opinions with his buddies about what we're saying about him down here. That's fine. I saw the sunburst coming through as we came in here, so that to me was a sign that he's at least going to make a quick stop by between all the people he's catching up with nowadays. You know, I love George just like he was my own grandfather. And I would call him and say, Georgie, and he'd say, grandson, and then we'd commence on whatever was going on over at the legislature. For those of you who aren't aware, I happen to serve in the seat that George was rightfully his a few times, but somehow the Secretary of State miscounted the votes, and so I got it later. So I really can't overstate the influence that he had in my life. I was a very nervous 32-year-old when he, I guess you would say, commanded me that I had waited long enough and it was time for Carol and I to have a child. And she celebrated her 8th birthday party earlier this afternoon. And I am not sure I would have, I don't know when I would have gotten around to it, because I kept finding excuses. And he said, you will never regret it. And he was absolutely right. He also convinced me to run for the legislature. And by convince, I mean he told me that, you know, you were given certain gifts, and by God, you owe it to the people of this state to offer yourself for public service. And it would be selfish and wrong not to. So not exactly the gentle persuasion that some of the candidate recruiters normally try and talk you into it, but the guilt trip worked, and he sort of knows what motivates me, and he had arranged, I think, to nominate me in his place when he retired from the Oregon Student Assistance Commission. And you'll get to hear from our next speaker, who made the probably foolish decision to take George's advice and appoint me to the Student Assistance Commission. So I was always following in George's footsteps with his direction and counsel. For George Bell, the public man, there is no higher calling than service to the people of this state. He loved Oregon dearly. And we know it's true because of the massive list of things that he did in public service. And I think there was a little bit of regret that he had not won his election to the legislature. But, and let me just say this, there's no doubt if he had been there, it would have been a force of nature on the House floor listening to George's speeches. It would have been incredible. There's no doubt about that. But I do want to share one story that is, for me, proof positive that he has a legacy in the Oregon Legislative Assembly. So this was late in the 2009 legislative session, and I was on my last legs trying to find votes for this bill that would designate the Metolius River as the first area of state critical concern. This designation had been created in the 70s when George was there, I'm sure, to help under Tom McCall, but it had never been used. And we were trying to get the last votes, and I was ragged, and I went over to George and Frankie's home, and I said, look, George, I don't have the time and I don't have the eloquence you do. Could you write an opinion piece for me and just ghost write this thing? Because I don't know what to do here, and I don't know how to get the public motivated. And he told me the story of the beach bill and how, you know, a call to arms might be necessary here. I said, well, you have to write it, please, because I don't have the time and I can't do what you do. So he drafted a piece for former Governor Vic Atiyeh and I to sign. Well, part of the challenge is we had to convince Vic to sign this thing and to endorse the bill. And it was further complicated by the fact that no Republican had yet voted for the bill. It had already passed the Senate 16-14. I think it had failed on the first try, 30-29, and one excuse. And this was our second vote to see if we could pass it. And I hadn't gotten one vote yet from across the aisle, which is not typical. I try to work in that fashion if I can. I just couldn't do it. So George writes it, and I come back, a few days later, and I take a look at his draft, and it was absolutely perfect. There was just not one word that I would change. So we turn on the speakerphone. We're sitting in the little library. We turn on the speakerphone, and we call Governor Atiyeh's home line. And it's on a Sunday, and he answers. So I explain, who I am, and that, we were working on this project, and he said, well, tell me about the bill. So I tell him about the bill, and I said, basically, we're going to allow a little limited development. They wanted 3,000. We're going to compromise and offer them 120 homes, and this is what they would legally be entitled to. And so we're just going to allow them to cluster them. So is there any chance, you would be interested in supporting this? And there's this silence for a second. George and I are just looking at each other. It's not an air in either of our lungs. And he said, I only have one question. He said, why do we have to give those developers that many homes? And I explained to him, well, if they legally are entitled to that many, we're just going to allow them to cluster them. And he said, okay, that's fine. I'll support the bill. And so then I read him George's op-ed, and he said, great, we'll sign it. So off to the presses, we sent it to the state's newspapers that night, and the vote was coming up maybe 2 days later. And the gentleman who switched his vote from no to yes and passed the bill, in press accounts later, said that the reason he did it in large part was this massive outpouring of authentic emails, not forum emails, authentic emails, phone calls, and handwritten letters that he had received over the previous days. So George was like pumping his fist. I mean, I didn't say George was listening, and so George is, yes, just as George liked to do. And then we hang up, and he's like, hot damn it, all right, we're in the game. And so bill passes, and I will always treasure, and I think you should too, that for decades, if not hundreds or thousands of years, for generations, there will be a spot in Oregon where George and Vic, on a summer day, a hot summer day, you can stand at Wizard Falls and see a vapor rising off the river, and you'll know they're there to check back on their preservation efforts and maybe just catch a bull trout rise. So I want to introduce the next speaker. And I keep something that my wife, I think about 15 years ago, wrote down, and it sits on our refrigerator. When I go to get my milk, it's always right there. I got to put it back when we're done with this. It says, the business of citizenship doesn't end at the ballot box. It's a beginning. This was Governor Kitzhaber sometime in the middle of his first term, maybe second term, I'm not sure when, but Carol noted it and wrote it down and stuck it on the wall. And both of us have felt obliged, as I told you, by people like George, who directly told me I had to do these things, whether I liked it or not. You owe it to people. But we also have felt a real sense of inspiration from people like John Kitzhaber for a long time. He was our formative mentor and hero from afar, and it was an incredible opportunity to get to serve with him. I always was a staffer watching him, but I got to serve with him and occasionally get my arm twisted into a vote here and there and do some really great things for this state. In particular, the 2011 legislative session where we were at a tie. And as you know, this federal government has been at an impasse even when there's no tie for decades, it seems. And this man guided our state through, I can tell you firsthand, one of the most tumultuous budgets we've ever dealt with. And if you consider the state of the body politic for the last several years, including the Tea Party and the left, the Occupy movement, it's not a time people get along. And yet somehow, at the right moment, Governor Kitzhaber came along and we balanced the budget, we reformed our healthcare system, we reformed our education system, and this is on top of decades of things like watershed councils and all these, the Oregon Health Plan, all these things that have forever changed the face of the state. And so it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce you someone I love very dearly as well. I have, two very serious mentors in my life. One is somewhere up there, not far, I'm sure, and one is right here. And I'm happy to introduce you to my friend, Governor John Kitzhaber.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I hope George doesn't mind that. It's a little odd at a memorial service. I was just thinking, sitting next to Frankie that when I came to the legislature in 1979, Frankie Bell and Maribel Cadmus and Barbara Hanneman and a number of other people took it upon themselves to adopt me as their second son and gave me a lot of love and mothering and 3 decades of unsolicited advice. And it really is indeed a real honor to have the chance to join you today and say a few words in memory and in celebration of my dear friend George Bell. I must say that the beautiful and I would say achingly poignant blog that Jason Bell posted on January 1st, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely read it, shortly after his father's death, captures more than I could ever do the essence of the man, the father, the husband, the friend, and the citizen who walked among us for the past 88 years. How do you eulogize someone in 5 minutes? I may take 6. How do you capture their essence and what they really meant to us? And it's really a difficult task because George Bell was a man of many parts. Like George, I consider myself a writer, albeit not a very good one, but I work at it diligently. I write almost every day. And I also keep a day book that, in which I write down, my thoughts. Is this working here? Let's take this out. Is that working? All right. Here we go. In this little day book, I try to write down, my thoughts and the thoughts of others, things that amuse me and move me, and things that I find profound, that make me think and make me wonder. So when I was thinking, who knows? I'll just speak up, how's that? So when I was thinking about what I would write today, I thought what I would try to do is go through the day book and see if I could weave together a number of the entries into something that would capture the George Bell that I knew and that I loved. Now, George loved books, as you know. He loved to travel the world and cross the disciplines in the pages of his books. And so one of the first quotes that came to mind was a quote by Winston Churchill on this subject, and it goes, "If you cannot read all your books, fondle them." Typical Salem crowd getting ahead of the cadence of the quote here. "Peer into them. Let them fall open where they will. Read the first sentence that arrests the eye. Set them back on the shelves with your own hands. Arrange them on your own plan so that you at least know where they are. Let them be your friends. Let them at any rate be your acquaintances." George, as we just heard, and as we all know, is a man of strong opinions and was not shy about sharing them. He also did not suffer fools gladly. And I think George was an axiom and a practitioner of Edward Abbey, who once said that society is like a stew. If you don't stir it up every once in a while, then a layer of scum floats to the top. Now, I think more often than not, George was provocative just to be provocative, to see what he could elicit in people, which brings to mind another daybook entry, also from Edward Abbey, called "How to Overthrow the System." Brew your own beer, kick in your TV, kill your own beef, build your own cabin, and most importantly, piss off the front porch whenever you bloody hell feel like it. Now, that's one side of George, and I must say it was a side that I particularly enjoyed. But of course, there was another side to this remarkable individual. And I think it was captured by Willa Cather's observation that you can't paint sunlight. You can only paint what it does to shadows on a wall. Now, commenting on this remark, the great Wallace Stegner wrote, "If you examine a life, as Socrates has so tediously been advising us to do for so many years, do you really examine a life? Or do you examine the shadows it casts on other lives? Entity or relationship? Prism or the rainbows it refracts? And what if you're the wall? What if you never cast a shadow or a rainbow of your own, but only have caught those cast by others? George Bell was not a wall. He cast shadows and rainbows on the lives of all those who had the great good fortune to meet him, and on the lives of many people who never met him because of his fierce belief in reading and in public libraries and in intellectual curiosity and intellectual freedom. I'd like to share one last passage from my day book, and I have no idea who wrote this, but I think that it captures, at least to me, some of what George Bell meant to me, and I suspect others in the room. And it goes like this. Over and over again, impulses from the world stir a responsive chord in me. Not just any chord, but a particular one, combining notes of elegance, exhilaration, simplicity, and awe. I feel for a moment at peace, in place, content. I sense in these momentary encounters a harmony between myself and whatever I behold. The word that seems to fit most exactly this resonance, this sympathetic vibration between inside and out, is beauty. George Bell was beautiful. And I think his life was captured in what a Paris art critic once wrote of Monet. Who inspired all of this? His flowers. For George, perhaps his books. Who was his teacher? His garden. Perhaps for George, his library. He owes it a great debt. He is proud of it. Such is the lesson that a plot of earth well sown can teach. That speaks to me of George and a life truly well lived, a full, rich life. I'm going to close with the words of T.S. Eliot, also from my day book, and of course T.S. was the person who also once wrote that they were decent people, their only monument the asphalt highway, 1,000 lost golf balls. Fortunately for us, from time to time, we're blessed by people like George Bell, whose rich life, and I think even his passing from it, has left us with a much more enduring monument. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, unremembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree, not known, because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between the waves of the sea. Quick now, here, now, always, a condition of complete simplicity costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crown knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Yes, George Bell has passed through that unknown gate, which each and every one of us will also pass through in due time. But he has not gone unremembered. Those of us who knew you, George, those of us who loved you, and touched you, and whose lives you touched, followed you across that plot of earth that was your life, well sown, learning as we went. And we follow you still, George. We follow you still. First star on the right, straight on until morning.
Good afternoon. I'm Tuck Wilson from Portland, Oregon, and I'm here to share reflections of 50 years of friendship with George Bell. I'll begin with Tom McCall's elevation from Secretary of State to Governor in 1966. That resulted in the appointment of Clay Myers, who had been McCall's assistant, to become Secretary of State for the balance of McCall's term. Meanwhile, my wife at the time and George's were co-workers at First National Bank of Oregon. George and I soon after became friends as well. I was a law student, and George was on the nightly news, KGW. It was about that same time that I met for the first time Jason Bell, and I took a liking to this boy. In fact, despite his parents' misgivings, I decided he should have a pocket knife. And I'm sure he could tell more stories. Soon after becoming Secretary of State, Clay, with whom I'd collaborated on Young Republican activities, let it be known that he was looking for an assistant. I recommended George. Despite being a Democrat, he was energetic, articulate, knowledgeable, and a very gifted writer. So George and Clay hit it off, despite their very different personalities. But they complemented each other beautifully as they dealt with the coming challenges. And as they say, the rest is history. The campaign to retain Clay was underway in September of '67. Forging George, now Clay's assistant and speechwriter, and myself as the campaign manager for the campaign, we were joined at the hip to beat Clay's opponents, both in the primary and the general election. Clay had never run for public office and faced experienced officials, and they were seasoned campaigners. But George succeeded in sculpting Clay's winning messages and prepped him for winning performances on grueling television debates. Following Clay's election, I opened a law office in Portland, Oregon, and George stayed on to manage the affairs in the Secretary of State's office in Salem. But we've continued to be friends throughout the years. George the poet. George, as you know, was an accomplished poet. On the occasion of my son's birth in 1971, and then again in 2004 upon the birth of Channing's daughter Sydney, George wrote beautiful poems that hang on the wall of their home in Anchorage, Alaska today. Starting in the 70s and continuing for some time, I had an annual Halloween party. It always featured political skits and poetry readings by George Bell. When Jan and I, who's sitting right here, were married just last year, the ceremony featured one of George's poems, beautifully read by Frankie. The poem was written for Frankie on her 35th birthday. Something about how we would grow old together. Many of George's poems were ultimately published by an admiring friend, Gary P. McMurray. Politics and friends. Our friendship was sustained by mutual interest in politics and fun. Highlights include sailing in the San Juans with Gary McMurray, flying with George and Frankie in my 1948 Stinson station wagon to various locations, and roundups. These roundups included the former assistants of Clay, including Kim Duncan, Dick Banton, George Galloway, and of course, George Bell. It included a noteworthy gathering at the site of the Coastal State Park, named for Clay at George's behest. Then there were martinis at 5, a favored ritual. It drew many of us to Salem throughout the years to discuss the issues of the day and the subjects of George's periodic op-eds in the Statesman Journal. In that same note, last fall, while George was in a care facility, we smuggled in 2 very small bottles of vodka concealed in a toothpaste box. Frequently on those occasions, George would talk about how proud he was of Jason and shared his son's endeavors as a teacher, as a writer, and an entrepreneur. You got the sense that George was living vicariously a bit through his son. In recent years, health issues took their toll on George's energy, mobility, but there was never any dimming of his keen mind, perceptive writing, nor deep interest in public affairs. A case in point. I spoke to George just after Christmas, and he related his recent hospitalization and the concern he had that it was placing a lot of strain on Frankie. And then, with characteristic energy, he posed the rhetorical question: what are we going to do about Donald Trump? I'm sure he's still working on that one.
I'm Nan Heim, or as I would prefer to be called today, Kiddo, because that's how George always greeted me, and I loved it. So, Kiddo. Frankie and George were 2 of the first people I met when I moved to Oregon some 41 years ago from Washington, D.C. And that was a very fortunate thing that I got to know them, because they were clearly the coolest couple in town. I think everybody would agree with that. And I got to know Frankie first because I'd never been to the Capitol before. I was supposed to be a lobbyist. It was the middle of session. And Frankie, of course, was then and always will be the queen of the Capitol, and she was so helpful to me. I got to know George through his spectacular library advocacy. Jim Scheppke is going to be talking a little bit about that later on. But he and I served together on the Oregon Library Association Legislative Committee. We have several librarians here coming from as far away as Tillamook to honor George today. But they can tell you that at many, many, many meetings, whenever somebody would say, oh, we should have a position paper, I would raise my hand and say, let's have George write it. I think George should write it. And he always would. And of course I did that because he was, as you have heard already and will hear again, a spectacularly beautiful writer. And as those of us who've been enjoying his blogs can attest, and Jason, I think that you've inherited his gift, and we all hope to read more of your writing. But I'm not here today to talk about his library role or even his role as a writer. I want to talk about George in a different role, and that is as a comedian. Yes, a comedian. Some years ago at an Oregon Library Association conference, see, they're already starting to laugh because they were there, George and Jim Scheppke put on a show one evening, and it was called the George Bell Film Festival. And those of us who were in the audience will probably never forget it. For their show, Jim and George showed and narrated scenes from a movie called The Far Horizons. And I should clarify that it was a 1955 Hollywood version of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Just a couple of years ago, Time magazine ran a list of the top 10 least historically accurate films ever made. It was on the list for sure. In order to picture it, you need to get in your mind this image. Donna Reed, bright orange makeup that highlighted her sparkling blue eyes as Sacagawea. And she wore a darling dress as she guided the expedition across Oregon. And all the while having a romance not with Charbonneau. No, she had a romance with Lieutenant Clark, played by Charlton Heston. And Meriwether Lewis, played by Fred McMurray, later of My Three Sons fame, frowned upon the romance, but he didn't have to worry because it was a 1950s Hollywood movie and nothing much happened. So in order to, while they showed these clips and narrated, they wore these sort of Davy Crockett hats, the fur hats with the little tails in the back. And as they showed one hilariously awful clip after another and explained the historical inaccuracies, they kept totally deadpan faces and expressionless voices. I don't do deadpan well, so I can't do it, but I can tell you it was hilarious. And those of us in the audience still talk about how we laughed so hard that we hurt. There is one redeeming feature of this movie, and some of you already know it, and that is that George had a bit part in the movie, even a speaking line. And you need to see it, and I understand you will be seeing some of it, because he is amazing. On looks alone, he could have been a Hollywood star. However, he told me he found making the movie very boring, and luckily for all of us, he didn't pursue that path. But here's what I'm going to do and what I recommend to everybody. Seeing just a few scenes of it today won't be enough. You can get the movie. I looked this up from Amazon, only $7.49. And I think you can rent it less expensively even from Walmart. And I am going to make myself a martini. As Frankie knows, I much prefer champagne, but for George's sake, I'm going to have a martini. And first I'm going to drink a toast to Frankie and the family and Cooper and everybody who took such good care of George in those long months of his illness. And then I'm going to drink a toast or two or three or more to the real star of the show, our dear friend, George. Thank you.
I see trees that are green, red roses too. I watch them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I hear babies cry, watch them grow, and they'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, oh, what a wonderful world. rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of the people passing by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? But they really say, I love you. I see trees that are green and red roses too. I want them for me and I think to myself, oh, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of the people passing by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? But they really say, I love you. I see trees of green and red roses too. I watch them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I think to myself, what a wonderful you remember me when the west wind moves among the fields of barley. You can tell the sun is jealous sky when we walked in fields of gold. So she took her love for to gaze a while among the fields of barley. In his arms she fell as her hair came down among the fields of gold. Will you stay as you lie in fields of gold. You remember me when the west wind moves among the fields of barley. You can tell the sun in his jealous sky when we walked in fields of gold. When we walked in fields of gold. When we walked in fields of gold.
Good afternoon. I'm Anna Peterson. I'm the mayor of Salem, but that's certainly not my claim to fame. My claim to fame is that I was set on the road for my career in journalism and politics by none other than George Bell. Truly a gift to me years ago, and I'll tell you a little about it. Well, I was born into I married into a friendship solid and true between my husband, Edwin, and George, and Clay Myers, and Tuck Wilson, and Frankie. And so I learned to love all of them because they were working hard to make Oregon better. And I was inspired, a young person, and I had my dreams about what I might do someday. And I always enjoyed listening to George, and one of my greatest thoughts about George is that he was always willing to share his knowledge, to share information about what was going on in the Capitol, and how government worked, and how things could become bills, and how things could go through. And he taught me so much, and always in a way that never looked down, never put himself up, but I knew he was up there because of the accomplishments that he already had. And this was just in the 70s. So then on to the 80s. And I was in the journalism school at the University of Oregon and commuting back and forth. And came summer and I was looking for an internship. So of course I strolled the halls of the Capitol and I went to talk to Frankie Bell, because you go to talk to Frankie Bell. If you want to do anything over at the state capitol or in town, you go and talk to Frankie Bell. And Frankie said, "What are you doing?" And I told her, and she said, with those big blue eyes, "Go and see George." So I did. I think she had him on her speed dial because he was warned I was coming. And George sat with me and interviewed me for that internship as though he didn't even know me. And I thought I could do this without getting emotional, but you know, we can't. He treated me like a person who seriously wanted a career, seriously wanted to do something in politics, to do something in journalism, to do something in this community and in this state. And I really appreciated that because he didn't ask me if it was okay with my husband if I did it. And he didn't ask me if my children would be okay at home if I was gone all day. I'd already had people question me about things like that because, you know, even in the early 80s, I see some heads nodding, that happens. George never would have talked to a woman like that. And I always appreciated that about George. So my internship began. And that was the best summer that I'd ever had because day after day after day, I had the opportunity to learn from George. And his gentle guiding his bright mind, his sharp red pen, but always his gentleness, his encouragement to me. And I watched how he worked with other people. Here he was, the Director of Public Affairs for ODOT. And he was working with a variety of people in the department and with political officials of all stripes and all rank. But to every one of them, he showed respect. To every one of them, he was collegially focused to do the best job that he could and to help the rest of them to do their best jobs. I learned in that internship a lot more than just how to write. But I will tell you, I did learn how to write. George was grease lightning when it came to a press release or an op-ed opinion or a speech that someone needed. I could see him just burn up the page and come out with the best work. It was impressive. It was impressive. And so from that, I did go on. I got a degree, and probably a lot of you know that did different things around Salem, and then here I am as the mayor. I want to tell you that when I came into office, George and Edwin were often having lunch, and George said, "Tell Anna that I'm here if she wants any help or advice." And that was a gift. And I turned to George upon occasion, and he had that wonderful way of explaining the other side, explaining all the sides, explaining the background, and helping me to understand how other people felt. And that was a gift. And I think that it helped many times in the work that I was doing, and certainly in the work that others were doing as well. Over the years, George and I had a wonderful email friendship, and I brought one of my emails. I won't read it to you, but it kind of goes on and on. But we used to write about poetry because I love poetry and I love reading it. I'm not good at writing it, but I enjoy others. And sometimes I would be on vacation especially and have a stack of books by me, and I'd read a bunch of things, and then I'd write, maybe share one with George. And he wrote back on one of these, and he said, "I really like that poem, and I think I would like the poet. I'd like to meet him." That's the way George was. He always was interested in other people. He was always interested in learning what other people were doing and how did they do what they were doing. And he was always interested in understanding them as well as sharing his knowledge with them. So those emails I will miss. I think we will all miss many things about George. I know that Salem is a better city for George. He, in that blog that so many of you probably received, I did, he helped us to think about the other side and the other opinion and another way. And again, I think he helped spur communication even among people who didn't have a chance to sit down next to each other. Through the miracle of email, we all are networked together. And George could bring us together, and he brought the debate and the discussion. And I think Salem is a better city because of that. I certainly know that I am a better person because of the way George touched my life. I'm going to read a poem. This is one of his books, and I was very honored to receive this. He actually gave this to Edwin and me in 2002. So this poem is a particularly fitting, I think, today. It's called Outward Bound. I feel myself leaving you, tugged gently from the land, caught in an outward current. Secret orders have been read, and my lines already cast off. There's scarce time for goodbyes. This long, unsought sea voyage, I've been told nothing more, will cure all that ails me. George, you're gone, but you will never, never be forgotten.
Hello, my name is Jim Scheppke, and I was the State Librarian of Oregon for 20 years. And I want to say a little bit more about George's role with the library community and his influence on a whole generation of Oregon librarians. But I want to tell you also, I have 3 assignments for you. 3 assignments. So if you have a pen, you might want to take it out because you might have to jot something down. It's so fitting that we're having this celebration at the Salem Public Library because, as everyone here knows, George adored libraries. He adored books. He was on the Salem Public Library Advisory Board and then was appointed to the State Library Board, where he served for 2 terms, 8 years. And when I was promoted to be the Oregon State Librarian in 1991, George was the chair of the board. And he was my rock. He was my greatest mentor by far, and I know I'm expressing the same thing you've heard from many of the other speakers. When he hired me, I can tell this story. This is one of my favorite George stories. He said, "Jim, I want to talk to you." This was right after I'd gotten the appointment by the State Library Board. "I want to talk to you. Let's go to your office." So, you don't say no to George. It's like, okay, let's go. And I thought he might say, "Well, congratulations. You gave a great interview. We're really looking forward to your service." No, if you know George, that's not what he said. He said, "Jim, you almost didn't get hired." He said, "I don't know if we made the right decision or not, but you've got to pick it up, man. You've got to step up your game, and you've got to prove that we did the right thing." And of course, I was floored, and I was bummed out, for about a day. But after that, I thought, that's exactly the best advice that anybody could give to me. And I thank George for it. That got me off on the right foot. George was a mentor, not only to me, but really to a whole generation of Oregon librarians. And I want to note one in particular. Her name is Deborah Jacobs, and that name won't mean anything to most of you, but it'll certainly mean a lot to the librarian row down here, because Deborah Jacobs happens to be one of the greatest librarians of our generation, really. And she got her start at the Corvallis Benton County Library. That's where George and I met her. She was the director there, and she did such a fantastic job that we decided she should be the National Librarian of the Year. So, of course, George wrote a nomination for that, and of course, when George writes a nomination, it's a given that she's going to get the award, right? And she did. And she went on to be the director of the Seattle Public Library, where she built that fantastic downtown library that Seattle is now famous for. That was Deborah's work. And today, she is the head of the Global Library Program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And she's done that job now for a number of years. So she's improving libraries all over the world. She wanted to be here today, but she couldn't because of her job responsibilities. But she did send me an email that she wanted me to read, and I'm going to do that right now because she remembers how important George was to the library community when we really faced a crisis. And Deborah writes, "Like everyone else here, I remember so much about George, and I want you to know that so much of who he was, guided my life as a librarian and a leader. I met him 25 years ago during the selection of Jim Scheppke as Oregon State Librarian, and I'm sure I'm not alone in truly believing that where I am today, who I am today, is hugely because of his influence. George guided me and the Librarians of Oregon and the Oregon Library Association during our 1992 Oregon Citizens Alliance fight to ban government funds from being spent to, quote, endorse or support homosexuality. The Oregon Library, in the Oregon Library Association, we decided to take the issue on full force. Thanks to George, we didn't go the route that we had intended, which was to talk about all the things that would be destroyed in public libraries if the measure were to pass. George told us to focus and on what was our moral edge, and that was our book collections. When we began broadening, George, sometimes not so gently, pulled us back to our focus. The Oregon Library Association became a major force in Oregon during this election, and you know what? The day after the election, which the Oregon Citizens Alliance blessedly lost, their leader was asked, what went wrong? And his response, quote, we never should have gone after the books. The Oregon Library Association was given awards for our campaign, but it really was all George. This lesson not only guides me constantly, but has become core to my personal and professional values. Focus on and stay true to who you are, our potential, our power. This value is core to me, and each time I tell this story, it influences and impacts librarians everywhere. Not just here, but from Indonesia to Ghana to Bulgaria, everywhere I speak. George is with me, and I believe his influence grows and blossoms. Thank you, George, for the gifts you shared. I retired 4 years ago and got to spend lots of time with George after my retirement. Those were very enjoyable times. We watched lots of Duck games together. I smuggled in some beer once when he was at Avamere, I think, and we drank beer during the Ducks game. We weren't supposed to do that. But one of the things I helped him with was his blog, Paul Watch, I never knew how to pronounce it. And I wanted to note that Bonnie Hall is here, and she's the one that got him started on that. But after he got going, and this was in August of 2010 that he started that blog, I helped him a lot. He gave me a password, and he did misspell. Even though he's a beautiful writer, he misspelled words and had typos, and I fixed those. And George said once, you know, even great writers need an editor. So I was happy to be able to do that. And you know, that's my first assignment for you, is if you've never read George's blog, or even if you were a faithful reader of George's blog, it's still there and you need to read it. And I would recommend you go back to it today, tomorrow, and just browse through it. It's so beautiful and so wonderful. And if you go to georgebell.wordpress.com, that's the URL. It'll take you there, and all the posts are there all the way back to August of 2010. So that's your first assignment. George and I, we also traded a lot of book recommendations. And I was very pleased that one of the last blog posts he wrote, he actually mentioned a book that I had recommended to him. And I thought I would recommend it to all of you today. And this is what George said about it. He said, it's a splendid, clearly written book. He posted about it in the blog. It's a splendid, clearly written book, and blessedly easy to read. I recommend it highly for any of you who have questions about where we all come from, why we're all so different, and how we got where we are now. And the title of the book is Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind by Yuval Noah Harari. He's an Israeli writer. And that was the best book I read last year. So George and I agreed on that. And I was very happy that he posted about it on November 1st. So write it down. Sapiens. That's your assignment. Great book. The other thing that I want to note that I helped George with that I enjoyed a great deal. There's a wonderful website called Oregon Poetic Voices. And it was a project of the library at Lewis and Clark College. And the state library actually funded this as a library project. We gave them a grant. And their task was to go out and record poets all over the state and put them up with audio readings of their poems on this website. And you can go there, assignment number 2, OregonPoeticVoices.org. And if you go there and click on George Bell, you'll actually hear George reading 5 of his poems in his wonderful voice. No one's talked about George's voice yet, but what a fabulous voice. Just hearing his voice is worth it. So go to OregonPoeticVoices.org, and he selected 5 poems to read, and I went and recorded those poems, and I passed them along to Lewis and Clark College, and they put them up on that website. And so it's just terrific, and I hope you'll go there and listen to these 5 poems by George Bell. One of them is the poem that our mayor read a minute ago. I want to end by reading, I plan to read another of the 5 poems that we selected, and I want to do that. It happens to be the one that's printed on the back of your program. I didn't know that, but I really wanted to read this today. It's called My Father's Son. One day, Mackinac against the cold, my father took me along with him, stretching to fit his footmarks in the snow, to a meeting at his union hall, and I stood buckle high by him amid the loud talk and laughter of heavy-booted mill workers shouting as over the whine of saws. A huge hand roughed my hair. "This boy is yours, Hayden?" My father's nod claimed me. "Yes, he's my oldest, George." The hand clapped my father's shoulder. "By God, he's a fine boy, Hayden, a chip off the old block." And the 2 giants grinned down at me. Suffused in a sudden warmth, my throat too tight to swallow, I looked back in helpless pleasure, to be measured so by a stranger. Later years turned us from each other, but never since have any honors won been equal to that shining moment when I was judged my father's son. Thank you, George.
I'm George's son, Jason, and I think we're probably testing everyone's endurance. Can everybody take one more speech? Thank you all for Frankie, Kenny, and Kelly, and our family for coming today. It means so much. Thanks, Governor, for your great words, Brian, and just fantastic, Anna, and Jim. It's my own personal thanks to my family, Frankie, and Kevin, and Kelly, for everything that they have done for George. I feel many of you spent more time with my father than I, and many of you worked with him and saw the different sides we've heard about today. I haven't been here all that much. A lot of that heavy lifting, as well as the love, has really been borne by Frankie, as all of you know, and by her coffee club and the Martini Club, and probably sustained her through some of the hard times in the last years when George has gotten more and also be grateful to Julie Souls, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, of the Salem Library, for allowing us to hold this memorial here, as Jim said, in George's church. So we've heard wonderful words about it today. A few more from me, and then we'll go downstairs. We'll be hiked out for some refreshments and toast George together, and we'll have some food. So it won't be long. George H. Bell, a triple spondee in poetic metrics. Coleridge called spondees the strong foot. Even George's name sounds like an assertion. And George was strong. He was declarative, intentional, powerful. We all saw that. He was also delicate. You could hurt him unintentionally and be banished from the kingdom on Mill Creek. This happened to me many times. Years could pass. This was confusing. Maybe for some of you too. Who did he think he was? Who was he? Who were you to him? Big questions for me still. And I'm not sure I really knew him very well. Last I saw him in December, he felt nothing tragic about his shuffling off this mortal coil, although he didn't like to shuffle. He loved Frankie and Kelly and Kenny. He had a good life, he said. He knew it, and said as much many times in that week in December. He knew he beat the odds, and he was satisfied, mostly. He was offered a lot in his life, and he took it. He was also incredibly warm with me. He held my hand, and together we erased a long blackboard of respective grudges in 1 week. I think I'm a lucky son. One thing I have realized in the last few years, there was a huge aquifer of guilt flowing underneath him. I know some of the glaciers in his past that fed that, but not all. For such a talker, he was also good at keeping mum. That saddens me. So who was he in the end? I'll have to switch to poetry for my answer. There are some inside baseball fishing images in this, so if you need clarification, I think Dan Simmons is here somewhere. This is called Left With This. I am left with this. My father was an extraordinary arrangement of words, opinions, and laughter, and abilities of frightening pride, and warmth, and passionate rejections. Although famished for our regard, he tended toward the solitary and nocturnal. He only appeared in public to be with us in private. Ultimately, he was phosphorus, mercury, gold, a thimble full of silver, a solution of ancient acids, and stricken iron. He was helium pretending to be hydrogen. He was humble carbon in its wood ash form and under pressure in its diamond. He was was all these metaphors and similes and metonymies and synecdoches, an extraordinary arrangement of letters, of the paragraphs and sentences and words that somehow make a man or not. He was a good read, a real page turner. We couldn't put him down. But now we've finished him. He's been returned to the library. He'll be reshelved, and then he'll go ex libris back into circulation with the atoms that make up the Oregon he loves so much. We'll reread him and reread him there, because we can't quite remember how it ends. He loved his Oregon. Now he is her. Dispersed, he'll be glad to be out in all her elements again. Now that he's gone, he will love his entrance. He's a natural. He'll be the first mixed metaphor that he can live with. And the one that we will have to also. He will love to participate in some new obsidian, to be in the water flowing through a steelhead's gills, to be a single pine needle of which no one has much expectation, to have a lead role in that certain kind of evening light that looks for all the world like stagecraft, like rosy fiction. He'll love his long last scene, that endless Multnomah of the Librarian. By loving him, we allow him all that, and we sentence him to such a life in us without parole. He only let us catch him just to marvel at him for his moment, to feel his strength on the end of the line. Let's tell the truth. We saw the flashes. We didn't catch him. Deep into our backing, he jumped, made a big splash. He broke this lead. I'm gone. He made the reel sing so. Now we'll just have to let it go. There are more copies of both his wonderful books. Please take them. Extras for yourself, your friends, your kids. We will follow the sound of the pipes out. Thank you, sir.
One, you gotta hurry, he's off in the hall.
Great to see you. she entered.